Tory. We're talking about the election, big chat around the election today. We've also got Angela Haggerty and Andrew Learman on the show to do the newspaper review. Angela's editor of the Common Space and a columnist for the Sunday Herald, and Andrew is freelance journalist and a stand-up comedian.
We've also got Dr. Craig McCangus of Aberdeen University. He's a politics lecturer. He's going to talk us through the mechanics and the mathematics of the election results.
I'm glad someone can do that because we've struggled the past few weeks.
Totally. Yeah, I thought I had it on Tuesday. I thought I've got that, and it's gone again.
Nope.
We're also looking at the impact of the second vote and the outcome, and we'll try and explain that one too. Also be speaking to the newly elected SNP MSP Jean Freeman, who won the Carrick, Cumnock and Doon Valley seat. And we're going to do the newspaper review in a minute. But first of all, Michelle, how was your week? How are you feeling after the election? You feeling good?
Yes and no. I felt not good to begin with, and then much better. A few arguments and controversial conversations with neighbours.
Arguments with whom?
With a Labour supporter who was very upset that the SNP had forced her to vote Tory twice.
That was really nasty of the SNP to do that.
Wasn't it just?
Absolutely.
How was your week?
My week was great. I mean, I'm feeling good. If I could sing, I would be singing Reasons to be Cheerful. Because I think
I was going to say,
what?
Feel free.
No, I'm not going to do that. I said if I could sing. But no, I thought the election result was okay. I'm struggling a bit with the analysis of it, because if you were to read the analysis of it, you would think the big victor of the election result was Ruth Davidson, which I'm kind of struggling to understand. But hey ho. But we shall see, and we'll see how the papers reviewed it today. So we'll talk to Angela and Andrew first of all. And I think the first thing we're going to look at in the paper review is, I think it's the Mail on Sunday. And they're looking at, I guess, what they would describe as a nightmare scenario of the SNP being held to, pushed to the left, or indeed the hard left, by it could be a terrible situation where Nicola Sturgeon has to go to the Greens to get support for a budget. The Greens would say, yeah, we'll support you, but you have to agree to a ban in fracking, as opposed to a moratorium which bans fracking forever. And that would be clearly such a huge difference that civilization would probably crumble.
Possible.
But we'll see. But so again, it is also they've got the picture all over the papers today of the new batch of MSPs, SNP MSPs
at the Kelpies. It's a fantastic picture.
It is a fantastic picture. The Mail on Sunday says it's the Sturgeon has to get used to the fact that it's not a one-horse race, which is true because there are two Kelpies, so it's a two-horse race. I think that the metaphor's a bit weird.
But that's the Daily Mail.
That's the Daily Mail for you. Angela, what were you thinking? What did you think about the coverage today?
Yeah, I think the Daily Mail's been quite interesting. What was it? They had a piece yesterday about Patrick Harvey, and they called him a power-mad
zealot.
Power-mad zealot, was it? So he's now sort of...
And pompous as well. They called him pompous as well. So get that.
Pompous.
You sure that wasn't humus and they misspelled it?
But it seemed on social media that was a great endorsement of Patrick Harvey, and everyone was quite happy with that. So, but yeah, it's very much Ruth Davidson is the star of the show. It's all about Ruth, big pictures of Ruth, and as you say, Richard, you know, if you've looked at the newspaper coverage, you would think that Ruth Davidson won the election, and that's not quite accurate. That said, though, you know, there has been a Tory surge in Scotland, and it is unprecedented in the sense that this isn't supposed to happen in Scotland. That, you know, people have been comfortable in the notion that in Scotland you don't have to worry about the Tories. So I think it's still definitely relevant to be talking about why this has happened and exploring that. However, to go from that to it looking like some sort of victory for the Tories rather than the SNP, which it clearly is, I think the press have been pushing that a little too hard.
Well, Fraser Nelson was on Andrew Marr this morning, and interestingly doing just that. Apparently, to be a Scottish Tory, it's no longer a contradiction in terms. That's what he said. And that the SNP have hit their peak, and it's all downhill from here on in.
No, I mean, well, it's a pretty decent peak. I mean, after 9 years, they've got a majority government, the highest probably vote of any political party since the devolution. So it probably is their peak because it's a pretty high place to be. As for the Tories, is this the resurgence of the Scottish Tories? I don't know. Are they toxic anymore? I don't think they are. I don't think they have been for a long time either.
Is Ruth Davidson a Tory?
Well,
is she?
Well, possibly no more than you know, most Scottish kickboxing lesbians who work in the media. I don't know. She's very approachable. She's very likable. I think a lot of people will have she's not Michael Forsyth, is she? You know,
She's not Michael Forsyth, no.
absolutely.
But the election literature didn't make great play on her connections to the Conservative Party. So therefore, I think she distances herself from that, and she did that quite effectively. And I think that's, you know, so I think a lot of it was her own personal appeal,
Sure.
because her personality is appealing to very many people. Also, should it come as a surprise to us that there is a vote in Scotland that supports the union? We kind of know that because it won the referendum. Although, does it surprise you that, Angela, that support for it is as passionate, or seems to be as passionate as it is?
Yeah, I think that for the independence movement, that they can take something out. It feels a little bit to me like there was a honeymoon period that nobody expected after the independence referendum. Everybody expected, if it was a no vote, for things to fall apart, for everyone to be quite despondent. It never happened. There was a surge towards the SNP. Then we had the general election where it was the destruction of Labour was very much on the cards. People were very angry and they wanted to show that in the ballot boxes, and they did. And so everyone's been in such a high. And then it feels like you got to Holyrood and it started to feel a bit more like a hangover. You know, there started to be a bit more bickering within the independence movement, and the conversation was very much about what you do with the second vote and how you should be splitting votes between, but it became very insular. It was all about what the movement within itself was doing. Meanwhile, unionists, no voters, some of them will be hardline, some of them not so much, maybe just a bit concerned about the disruption of all, you know, the IndyRef 2 talk. They sort of were regrouping towards the Tories, and it seems to have come to a bit of a shock for some of the people within the independence movement that vote happened. So I think, yeah, take a step back, look at these results, assess them, and try and figure out what that tells you about not just necessarily the SNP vote, but about the wider yes movement, the no movement, if there could be a no movement. Ruth Davidson is very, very hard on no to IndyRef 2.
Yes, sure.
She's made that a big part of her campaign, and she's been rewarded for that. So you have to look at that and try and figure out what it means and what it might mean for the campaign moving forward. The SNP is going to be doing something in the summer, we're told, to try and start bringing round no voters. So I'll be interested to see how they position that now.
Ruth Davidson, when she launched the manifesto, said the Tories would be doing something similar, you know, for the other side. So she very much made herself, you know, the face and the spokesperson for the no to IndyRef 2 during the referendum, and successfully, I think.
One of the themes of the coverage today, and indeed since the election, is, I guess, the fact that some of the leaders are female, and how that affects how it's written about, I guess, which I'm reluctant to venture into, but you can do that.
We've had this conversation before. When is it appropriate to talk about what a woman's wearing? And I think we agreed that when it was a colour piece, that's appropriate. When it's a news article and it's slagging a woman off for what she's wearing, then that's absolutely not appropriate. But this piece today in what are we in?
Sunday Times.
In the Sunday Times, Gillian Bowditch has been getting a bit of a hard time on social media this morning.
Indeed.
She's written this colour piece about the leaders and the results, and she started it, her intro, as Nicola Sturgeon changed into her favourite crimson Totty Rocks outfit to make her way to the Glasgow Count in the early hours of Friday morning. So clearly, a woman talking about another woman, but not in a bad way. She balanced it. But she balanced it. For the end, her final part was about Ruth Davidson, who tweeted at the end of the count, home after 40 hours in the go, pyjamas, hoodie, sofa, MasterChef, large glass of rum, and then to bed. So again,
sounds perfect.
It does actually, doesn't it?
Yeah. But is it bad to frame the coverage in that, I guess, looking at what women are wearing, or what they're wearing as they get ready, what they're wearing after it? Is that? What do you think?
I think it's a tricky area because obviously when we're talking about women, sometimes that kind of coverage is used or can come across as very condescending, and you know there has been and remains a problem with that. However, I still think that what a person wears, how they choose to present themselves, can tell you a little bit about their personality or the image that they're trying to project of themselves. So I don't think that in principle that has to be a terrible thing, and we have seen it happen with other people like Jeremy Corbyn. There was a lot of talk around around the time that he was elected leader of the Labour Party, around his election campaign, that, you know, kind of old jumpers and cardigans. What does this tell you about Jeremy Corbyn? You know, there was some talk about that at the time, and I think sometimes it can be interesting to look at that. So there's probably a balance in there somewhere, but I don't think that just the existence of coverage where you talk about what a woman is wearing necessarily has to be dismissed as straight off bad. I think sometimes there can be something useful in there.
Although there's also a suggestion that a kind of backlash against the portrayal of politics has been adversarial because it's like women fighting seems to be not a good image to use. But politics is adversarial, Andrew, isn't it? Is that, should you choose different language when it's women leaders?
What effect? I mean, I've not seen this. So people are talking like things like.
People are suggesting that the portrayal of politics as adversarial is not helpful because women leaders should bring a different flavour to the way politics is carried out.
Right. Okay. I mean, I don't think that's going to. The fact that you have the three largest parties, the three major party leaders in the Scottish Parliament are female, I don't think that would affect how people write about it or what people are expecting from Parliament. Maybe that's just me because I'm a middle-class white man, but I don't know.
There was a tweet from Libby Brooks, the Guardian journalist, this morning, which I noticed only very fleetingly glanced at it. And I think she'd referenced like I don't know if we have it around, the front page of the Sunday Herald, where Nicola Sturgeon's very much in a bring it on pose to Ruth Davidson, and saying that some of the other newspapers have positioned that in a similar sort of way, as if it's a fight between two women, and her view on it was that the only thing that was missing from the headlines was girl fight, to just be as blatant about it as that. But again, I'm not sure because I don't know, had these been male leaders, would it have been the same kind of coverage? It may well have been, so it's a very tricky one. But there has been some other talk. I mean, we're talking about newspaper coverage of gender, but some of the other things in the Sunday Mail, Laura Waddell writes about disappointment in the results themselves, at the lack of much change within the gender balance in Parliament.
Which is pretty much as it was before.
I think they have it down as 35%. Women, so although I think the SNP MSPs, I think the majority of the new ones were women.
Okay.
So, and I think Greens did try on the list to do it in such a way that they hoped more women would be elected, but it just didn't quite work out.
I think it was the Tories that brought the
right.
The overall.
We'll come back to the election later, but the story in the Sunday Herald, Andrew, that you saw of Sheikh Bayu.
Yeah, so Sheikh Bayu's family. It was the anniversary of Sheikh Bayu's death on the 3rd. And so there's a service in Kirkcaldy today where his family are going to lay some flowers at the scene where he died. So Sheikh Bayu was the Kirkcaldy engineer who died in police custody on the 3rd of May last year. He was sort of, police were phoned, he was walking home about 7 o'clock in the morning, police were phoned after a man was spotted behaving erratically. And then that's where it kind of becomes a little bit less clear what happened then. The family suggests that the coroner's report, he died from positional asphyxiation, I think that's the right term, which is effectively where someone is suffocated because someone is sitting on them. So the family are now suggesting that perhaps race played a role in his death, that it's an odd one. So the PERC, the Police Investigatory Review Commissioner, I think that's right, have been investigating this as they do for all deaths in custody for the last year. And there's kind of been this sort of information coming from the family and the information coming from the Scottish Police Federation and some insinuation, and it's all been a bit messy and a bit murky. And it's an interesting one because, as we talked about earlier, off camera there, had this happened in London, the reaction would be
very different. We would have, I think we would have heard more of an outcry. Yeah. We've been waiting there for a year, but it's sort of tied up with a sort of broader dissatisfaction with Police Scotland that reached a huge crescendo some months ago. Yeah. Stephen House has now left, but there's still a sort of backlash and still sort of legacy issues, indeed, with the spying, which is another story that you saw in the Sunday Mail, which is to do with police spying on journalists, basically. What's that about?
Yeah, this is connected. This is going a bit further back to the Emma Caldwell case. She was a sex worker who, I think it was in 2005, was murdered, and it later emerged that the Daily Record or the Sunday Mail had been doing some stories, I think, about a forgotten suspect in the murder case, and we now know that the police then tried to access the sources that the Sunday Mail had, The Sunday Mail's view on that was that they put more resources into trying to uncover their sources rather than the manhunt. It's just a further development in the story that the police knew that what they were doing was illegal, that they had had information that suggested to them that accessing sources in that way would not be entirely legal, but they've told Holyrood's Justice Committee something else. So it does get very complicated, and I think this is one of the reasons that people struggle to follow it, because you're going back quite a long time in a lot of these cases, and you're talking about what someone said and then what someone else said and then how they countered that, I mean, even just reading that story today, I think I've got a bit of an interest in this. Common Space covers this stuff, but even I'm struggling to remember which bit happened where, and how does this connect on.
Where does it go next? What's the next step in that?
It's a good question. One of the things about it that interests me has been about because one of the legislations that was involved in this stuff was the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, which is REPA. And that is now being done away with, and what we have now coming in is the IP bill. So there's been changes in legislation. How this all moves forward is a good question. I wish I knew the answer, but I don't. But what gets me a little bit is the lack. It's the same with the Sheikh Ubayu thing. I feel like there might be more movement in these things. There may be more inquiries set down. There may be more attention paid to this if the public were more energised about it. But it seems a real struggle to get them on board with some. I mean, as you say, if the Sheikh Ubayu thing had happened in London, there may have been a bigger outcry about it.
Sure.
I don't quite understand why there isn't so much in Scotland. These stories are really, really serious, but it feels quite often like they're just running along in the background, even when they're getting front pages.
Yeah.
They are
still
people aren't really talking about
still
them.
quite complicated, and that's quite a complicated story, as opposed to...
It is, but it's a very important story. We're talking about police accessing journalist sources here, and oftentimes with REPA, journalists had no idea that this was happening. They didn't know their sources were being tapped. So, and journalism is vital in democracy, shouldn't have to say that or overstate it. And these instances of police getting access to journalist sources is a very, very serious thing.
Yeah.
Indeed. Although there is another story today, which is a lot easier to understand, but Michelle Moore, Andrew, a bit embarrassing for us.
Easier to understand. It's a really
Yes.
odd
Although
story.
not so easy to understand
No.
what she was doing, making a motivational speech in Vietnam,
So,
but she was.
People had paid substantial amounts of money to come and hear Michelle Moore speak, and so this little boy, or she thought was a little boy, ran up to get a selfie with her, and it turns out it is in fact a 32-year-old man.
Yeah.
Sorry, a 46-year-old man.
She picked him up.
Like a
And his
child.
wife was in the audience and said,
Exactly.
"Put him down!"
It's incredible.
Well, what's
and
more incredible is that she actually tweeted her mistake
she
and told
did,
everybody.
absolutely. So everyone saw it. I mean, I don't know what she thought like a 6-year-old was doing at a motivational business conference, which is odd. The weirdest thing is that afterwards she said that everyone was fine and the man was understood and they laughed and it was okay. She says the guy was fine with it, but she should have known by his yellow teeth and the fact that he weighed 10 stone. So it seems a bit harsh, doesn't it? It seems a bit harsh to give him a kicking afterwards.
Yeah. It was her mistake.
Absolutely.
Not his fault for having yellow teeth and did he just
Being
stumble
old,
on?
yeah.
I think he might
Being
have
old,
stumbled.
yeah, maybe a bit heavier. Indeed, yes.
Angela, you've got a story you want to talk about, Willie McRae.
Yeah, this was quite an interesting one, and it's from the Sunday Express, which is a paper that wouldn't really be on my reading list on a Sunday, so it's been an interesting little thing. But it's on page 2, actually, the Sunday Express. They're saying that the Scottish prosecutors have taken the unusual step of releasing all publicly available documents regarding the death of firebrand SNP activist Willie McRae. And this is Willie McRae, who died in 1985 of an apparent suicide. He was found slumped in his car with a bullet wound to the head, and there has been campaigns since then from people who say that something more sinister was at play and that they think he was under surveillance from security services, etc. So, although I think they've struggled for much of that time to really get a great deal of coverage for those claims. So it's interesting that it's sort of fairly prominent here. Sunday Express, I think, is maybe overplaying it a little bit because it turns out that really what this is, it's the release of publicly available documents, as we were saying earlier.
Seems a bit bizarre.
Yes, you don't really release
Wouldn't it be
things that are
better-
already publicly
Wouldn't it be
available.
better to release documents that were not released?
Unavailable. But so they go on to say now the Crown Office has created a special page on its website to publish a tranche of documents it holds on the McRae case going right back to 1985. So it's basically they're creating a hub where they can put some of this information, and the campaign group Justice for Willie McRae, they've welcomed this. They have apparently, because the Crown Office rejected a fatal accident inquiry calls, they are launching their own investigation where they're getting people on board. I think it's former police detectives are helping them with their own investigation, so they're saying that they're going to find this very useful. So that it's just an interesting development on The Express does say 2 years ago this newspaper exclusively revealed claims that Mr McRae was in possession of a dossier containing the names of VIP paedophiles. So the interesting part to this is how it connects to some of the bigger stories that we know have come out.
It's a long-running story,
So,
and people have been trying to get at the truth, and nothing much has been revealed
So
for a
anything
long
that
while
helps
now.
that campaigning group get the answers is a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So that I thought that was just a little interesting snippet of developments there.
And finally, Andrew, you're another conference, from a motivational conference to a conference on boredom.
So it was the 6th annual boring conference in London yesterday, which is it sounds fantastic.
This is not drilling.
It's
not drilling as in
as in boring. But actually, they do have someone did give a keynote speech on boring.
He picked up at the wrong conference.
No, he just had an interesting speech on boring. Well, a boring speech on boring, I suppose.
So it ticked the box twice.
It did, absolutely. But it's sold out. So it's a 6th one. They've sold out every year. So 400 people squeezed into the hall. They discussed topics including the traffic lights on the pedestrian crossings in East Berlin, East Germany, between 1961 and 1998. That's one of the things. Someone did a 1,000-piece jigsaw live on stage.
Well, they put the jigsaw together.
Yeah, they did, absolutely. And interesting facts.
How long did that take?
I don't know, but I'm assuming it took all day. It doesn't, no time here. But,
that fact is too interesting.
Again, these are all facts which might make it
They're
interesting.
all interesting facts.
But this is also another fact, is that most 1,000-piece jigsaws are in fact 1,026 pieces.
That's amazing,
isn't it? Yeah. What else? So someone did something on toilet roll tubes, specifically the serial number inside each toilet roll tube, which I didn't realise that was a thing, but they've all got different serial numbers.
Have they?
So there we are.
I'll need to check when I go home.
Well, won't you? Yeah. Paper bags from independent bookshops, bricks, the word "the," a proposed alternative system of coinage, and the descriptions of desserts on menus in chain restaurants throughout the United Kingdom.
Okay. So fine. Next year we will be there. We will have an eyewitness report, and you will be that reporter.
Well, that's a contract there, Richard. So
Indeed.
you have to pay for that to happen.
Well, didn't mention the payment word. Okay, so that's great. Thank you very much. We're going to move on to some of the big international stories just now. Next, to welcome David Pratt, who's contributing foreign editor to the Sunday Herald. David, how are you doing today?
Not too bad. Not
Excellent.
too bad. Ridiculous to the sublime. Sublime to the ridiculous.
Indeed. You have a piece in the Sunday Herald today about Syria. Can you tell us a bit about that one?
Well, Syria's never far from the headlines these days, Richard, and I mean, this weekend's no exception. I mean, there's the ongoing talks in Geneva at the moment, which obviously have reached a very, very crucial stage. But perhaps what I think viewers won't realise is that there's a Syrian dimension right here in Scotland this weekend. The UN Special Envoy for Syria, Staffan de Mistura, is actually in Scotland this weekend. He has come here to help initiate this UN-led programme which is bringing together a Syrian Women's Advisory Board. And Scotland, the Scottish Government is actually funding this, so this is being launched this weekend. So the Advisory Board is basically taking a dozen Syrian women, and they're being trained in mediation skills to help with the negotiation process at the highest possible level, because women are clearly have an important role to play in that mediation process and often see things very differently from men when it comes to that point of view. So the fact that Staffan de Mistura has come here to Scotland, broken off, not broken off, but left the talks in Geneva, where he's been dealing with the likes of John Kerry and Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and come here to Scotland, is a bit of a feather in the cap for Scotland in terms of this particular position.
Okay.
Why did they choose Scotland? Why come here?
Well, it seems that, it's a good question. And I think the main reason is that, that there are, for example, there's an organisation called Beyond Borders, which is based in Borders of Scotland, which Mark Stewart Moore runs, and they've been heavily involved, the acts advisors to de Mistura himself. But most importantly, I think it appears that the UN and the UN bodies are actually very impressed by the kind of quality of gender politics here in Scotland. You know, we were talking earlier about the fact that we've got 3 party leaders here that are women. They're also fascinated by the kind of democratic process here in Scotland. So they've selected Scotland, and it's an enormous feather in the cap. Most people won't realise it, but I mean, it was in the SNP manifesto. I think it was tucked at the back in the international section, page 42 or something like that. But it's a tremendous feather in the cap and important for Scotland. The other thing is that, you know, it's happening just when the situation in Syria at the moment could not be worse. I know we often say it could not get worse, but it really is bad at the moment. There's a supposed ceasefire around Aleppo at the moment, which is just virtually on the point of collapse. I hate this term that the diplomats tend to use, and I'd be curious to hear what Mr. de Mistura has to say about it, which is this silence, a regime of silence, which is a euphemism for, you know, effectively a truce. Well, there's not much of a regime of silence in Syria at the moment, and it would be curious to see how the talks unfold in the next few days.
I think a piece in the Sunday Herald today suggests that this truce is not in any real sense.
One of the things that troubles me is that, you know, there's a lot of diplomatic clamour at the moment, but it kind of acts as a kind of mask for the reality of an ongoing war. So we hear about these ongoing diplomatic moves when the evidence unfolding every day. For example, we had the airstrike in the camp, the refugee or IDP camp at Al Kumeya just a few days ago. There's been mass graves found again in Iraq, neighbouring Iraq, same sort of regional conflict, that area is controlled by IS. People are starving in other areas. So, you know, the reality of war is ongoing, despite the fact that you've got these diplomatic moves. And no one, it seems, is actually holding anyone to account over this. I think this is one of the sad things about it. No one is actually saying, where's the accountability for this, you know, raising it with the Russian. Americans have been very, very quiet about it. They don't want to upset the apple cart too much at a diplomatic level. So, you know, while the talks are ongoing, it's not much consolation for the poor people of Syria who day in, day out are facing the horrors of this.
And what's the agenda for the trip?
The
trip to this week?
From Mr. de Mistura's trip here.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's been kept, I mean, from a security point of view, obviously his movements and indeed the movements of the women on the advisory board have been kept quite quiet and confidential. I mean, understandably, given his position. I don't think the UN are keen to kind of publicise where and what he'll be doing, or indeed the women themselves, obviously, if identified clearly at this early stage, it could be a security problem for them, so they want to keep that under wraps. But he's obviously meeting the women, he's doing a series of talks, there are seminars, he's helping promote the entire sort of programme, and they themselves are involved in various training seminars or whatever, which are preparing them for the fairly hefty sort of responsibility they'll have at a mediation and negotiation level in the months ahead.
Okay.
Also, serious. We used to laugh when people talked about Donald Trump. Now,
The
not so much
Donald,
laughter.
yes,
the
the
Donald
Donald,
is
indeed, the Donald.
Is
I know every
risk.
time I sit here and we talk about the Donald, he seems to take one step closer towards potentially being in the White House. You know, we make House of Cards look like the kind of Ovaltinis, I think, if he became president. I personally am not convinced, and I think if you begin to look at a lot of the background to this, I'm not convinced that Trump is there yet by any margin. You know, that there are lots of stats around at the moment. The polls, if you look at it closely, there's still a huge number of Americans very much opposed to Trump being president. You know, the Latino vote, the African American vote, you know, clearly the women's vote, clearly against Trump in that way. You know, and if you take a simple detail, for example, you know, he would need the black African American vote in order to take somewhere like Florida. He's not going to take Florida. I think the last time any president of the United States, you know, became president, you know, not having taken Florida, was Calvin Coolidge in 1924 or something like that. So, you know, and America, you know, at the moment is actually, the economy is doing not too badly. You know, it's moving along nicely. The price of fuel, close to Americans' heart, petrol, the big gas guzzlers, is down. You know, unemployment's not too bad at the moment. And you're forgetting the kind of campaigning that Barack Obama will bring to bear. You've noticed this loosening up of Obama lately in terms of his, you know, his appeal in the media and stuff like that. But he'll also be lining up his guns to support the Democrats. And, you know, this is going to bring a lot of pressure on Trump himself. So I don't think it's a shoo-in by any stretch of the imagination.
Isn't massively popular either. I think I read somewhere that actually these are the two least popular candidates for decades that have fought to get into the White House.
Absolutely. I mean, she's got as many detractors within the Democrats as she has supporters. And there's another dimension as well. I mean, you know, Clinton carries a lot of baggage around with her. You know, there was a remark she made recently in Ohio where, you know, she did say afterwards that she didn't mean it in the context in which it was said, but it was said and it came out, which is, you know, we'll be getting rid of the jobs of coal miners and coal businesses here. It was said in the context of some environmental, but she was taken to task. You don't, in Ohio, stand up and make remarks about that in a coal mining area and expect people to vote for you. So she's regarded as something of a clumsy politician. And then she's got the kind of baggage of the Benghazi affair, the dodgy emails and the leaks. All of that will be brought to bear, and you can bet your bottom dollar that Donald, in his very sort of guerrilla warfare campaigning style, will pull out all the stops and bring all these pressure points to bear as we move into the head-to-head between them.
Indeed. Well, from one election, which is still to come, to another, which is just finished. Could we welcome to the stage Craig McCangus, please, and we'll talk about the election results that we've just seen in the Scottish election.
Thank you.
Craig, how are you?
Good.
Good. I'm good, thank you. Yes, so, second vote. How big a deal was that in the SNP failing to secure a majority again?
It depends. I mean, you could look at it as they missed out on Dumbarton by about 100 votes. Ruth Davidson's majority is about 600, something like that. So if they'd won those two seats, they would have had a majority. So you could look at it as 700 odd constituency votes then in these two places, then they would have won a majority on the constituency alone. Well, with the lists of seats that they got. It did make a difference in the end. I think they only won list seats in Highlands and Islands and in South Scotland. And they probably missed out on a couple of seats here and there by 2-3%. Their list vote is down by a couple of percent this time around. So I think the list has cost them to a certain extent. They're about, I think, according to my calculations anyway, about 1,600 votes short in central Scotland and just under 3,000 short in West Scotland.
Is there any evidence to suggest or to support the theory that those votes that would have gone to the SNP went to the Green Party?
At least on the aggregate level, when you're looking at the data, how much the Greens went up, how much the SNP... I mean, we must remember that the SNP vote did go up.
Yeah.
More people did vote for the SNP on the list. It's just that other party shares went up higher. So it looks as if the SNP share is lower, but as in raw numbers, they did win more votes. The Green vote was up a lot in some areas. It was about 13,000 votes in Edinburgh. And that probably, if out of that, and the SNP were about 5,000 short of getting a seat on the list. So how many of those people that voted Green would have maybe voted for the SNP in a different context? We can surmise that probably some of them, but we don't actually know until we get the individual level data to find out how people felt about particular parties and where they maybe put their vote in the past. We simply don't know. But in Glasgow, the Greens piled on about 11,000 votes compared to 2011, 7,000 in central Scotland, and the SNP were 1,600 short. So there probably was something there. Yeah.
Let's go back into history. When, not that far back actually, but when they devised the voting system for Holyrood, what was the purpose of the vote? Why not just go first past the post?
Well, if we think about firstly the proposals for a Scottish Assembly in the 1970s, that was a purely first past the post system. Obviously that never came to be. I think the general consensus is that during the Constitutional Convention talks with Civic Scotland and the Liberal Democrats were involved at that point as well, it was basically a compromise that Labour had to come to, that some element of proportionality had to be built into the system. So the system that was put in place was basically a first past the post system with a top-up additional member system to counterbalance that first past the post system. So you've kind of got the best or the worst of both worlds depending on your point of view.
I wonder, was that could be interpreted two ways. That could be interpreted as a means to devise a voting system which gave a greater sense of proportionality to the result, or it could be a system which was determined to make sure that no party, and particularly not the SNP, would ever get a majority. Was it Which of those is true, do you think? Was it an attempt to actually, let's be fair, or was it an attempt to let's scupper the SNP?
It was probably both. I mean, let's not forget that there was probably people in those, because the SNP kind of stepped out of those constitutional debates in the 1980s to an extent, and that's actually probably what helped. You know, the SNP and Labour involved in that conversation may have made things even more difficult. So the Liberals at that point, I'm assuming that some of them would have thought, well, this is actually going to prevent Labour getting a majority and gives us a chance of coalition government. And we see at the first two Scottish Parliament terms that was the case. But the whole idea of the Scottish Parliament was to be different from Westminster. So by having a system that does encourage people to vote for smaller parties, that tactical voting isn't the only thing that you need to do, that you've got that second vote. So if you are a Conservative that lives in East End of Glasgow, then you have an opportunity to get some representation on the list, or Green or Socialist or whatever that might be. So it's probably both, I would have thought.
Apart from the voting system, what's the difference, if there is any, between Scottish voters, English voters, Welsh voters? How do they differ?
In many ways they're not that different. If you look back at, say, 2007, 2011, why did the SNP win these elections? You find what we class in political science called valence voting. So it's basically which party and which leaders of those parties are best placed to deliver commonly held objectives. So things like, very few people would argue that you want a worse NHS. Most people say you want a better NHS, you want better schools, you want better roads, you want better infrastructure, etc. So which party is best placed to do that? And people make their judgment based on how they feel about a political party, how they judge their leaders, and those two things which drove to a large extent why the SNP won in 2007 and 2011. The other thing that's important for the Scottish electorate is how well will a particular party stand up for Scotland, stand up for Scottish interests. Now that can mean anything if you kind of break it down. But at the end of the day, especially in 2011, far more people thought that the SNP would stand up for Scotland, would be a more effective voice for Scotland in Holyrood, and so therefore put their vote behind them. And it was interesting that in 2015, where historically people have felt that the Labour Party was best placed to do that changed, and the SNP are now the best party, according to the electorate, to defend interests at Westminster. Valence voting is common across the UK. This isn't something this has been happening as a process of kind of social de-alignment from old social class voting, as old industrial heartlands have broken down. Society is far less unionised than it used to be. People are far more socially mobile. The middle class has expanded, and people are less kind of attached to a political party as part of their identity, in a way that they would have been maybe 50 years ago. So this is a long-going process, but it has a contextual element in Scotland within the context of Scottish politics.
Is it possible to use your second vote tactically? Is it possible to tactically vote?
It's pretty difficult, I think. How do you coordinate a mass kind of tactical vote?
There's a lot of people this week think that was the case,
well,
and
I
indeed
think
are griping about it quite considerably.
No, I would agree. I think quite a lot of people probably. I mean, how do you? What is it you want to achieve? I think is the key thing. If you are voting, somebody might have said, right, I think the SNP are going to win all the seats in my constituency, all the constituency seats in a region. So I'm going to vote for another party on the list, because essentially my second vote isn't going to be represented in the form of a party, because the SNP will miss out. So I think a lot of people voted that way. But then you could turn that around and say, well, there were probably a lot of people who kind of did both votes SNP because they felt, well, we have to make sure that the SNP at least get kind of on the seventh rung of the ladder when it comes to the regional list votes. So there is evidence, I mean, there is academic evidence of people ticket splitting on the basis of coalition preference. So they'll split their vote according to which kind of parties they feel they would like to see in government. They maybe vote Labour in a constituency, Lib Dem on the list in the past, or SNP Green, or whatever that might be. So there is evidence of this happening. But how you tactically vote is you can tactically vote in completely different ways. It's quite difficult. It's a different kind of tactical voting from, say, in a constituency where I'm a Conservative voter, don't like the SNP, don't like Labour, but I like them a a bit more because they're unionists, so I'll vote for them, hoping that they'll beat the SNP. So there's a different context, I think.
Andrew and Angela, I mean, your readers, both in Common Space and in the National, they're pretty committed, politically aware readers. Did you, and Angela, first of all, do you think your readers got how the second vote worked and how to use it to achieve what they wanted to achieve?
No, I don't think that everybody by any means got it. I think there was a lot of debate around how votes could be used, and I think it eventually became so tense. There was so much arguing and bickering going on online. I think a lot of people probably largely switched off from that, and I think maybe we've overestimated a little bit about how much people were using that second vote as a tactical vote necessarily. I think a lot of times people will just vote for the parties that they think that they like, and they might be misunderstanding what the purpose of the votes are for. I don't think it needs to be anything more sinister than that. It's been quite strange to see the reaction to the result from some of those people who were doing a lot of the coverage around the list votes, because they're sort of spinning this as if it's been some sort of disaster for the SNP because they've lost that majority, and it's the fault of the list voters, the splitters, who gave their second vote to a different party, and I think that's been way over negative. You know, the SNP is getting into its third term in government, and what it did in the last election was unprecedented in a voting system that was more or less designed to avoid that. They're only 2 away from a majority. There is a majority of pro-independence MSPs in Parliament, so the idea that this list thing is being some sort of real kind of bone of contention. I don't know whether we're maybe overestimating that a little bit just based on what's going on in social
I think
media.
one of the sad things actually as well, Angela, is that a lot of people have risen to the bait over this. You know, I mean, there's a lot of people that have just seemed to have already embroiled in an argument over this stuff. I mean, I was a series of exchange tweets with Ian McWhirter yesterday, and we kind of came to the conclusion it's time for calm heads and remaining focused here, rather than sort of digging through all this stuff and pointing fingers and blaming whatever. Because one of the things that I find interesting is what tactically or strategically will the respective parties' roles now be in light of the result that we have. I mean, I don't know if you think that will change actually in the coming months.
Well, we've got our guest who can help cast some light on that, I think. If we could welcome Jean Freeman, the new SNP MSP for this side, for coming up in Dunvale. Welcome, Jean, and congratulations.
Thank you.
How are you feeling? Have you recovered?
Sure, yeah, I feel good.
Good. Did you feel the campaign was, I guess, difficult in terms of the yes movement, in terms of the SNP both votes thing? Was that a tricky thing, or was that, do you think, in retrospect, that has been proven to be the right campaign message to put across?
I think it was the right campaign message for the SNP, because it was a message designed to ensure that the SNP would win the maximum number of seats in the Scottish Parliament, and that's been the case. I think that, I mean, I understand that, when we lost the referendum, people were very passionate about that. People became involved in politics for the very first time, often, particularly a lot of women, but also a lot of young people. Very passionate, enjoyed that whole campaign, opened up new doors, new ideas, new ways of thinking. To lose that was completely gutting. And your passion doesn't go away. Now, if political parties can't continue to capture a role for you in pursuing that passion, you're going to take it somewhere. And if you take it into social media, which is at best a two-dimensional forum, at best, where we're all talking to each other, then we're going to get into this, it's your fault, no, it's your fault, no, it's your fault. Now, my take on that is we need to stop it, because actually the people that benefits most are the ones who want us to remain part of the union.
Yeah,
and
That
love
was
the idea.
evident. That's been evident over the
Love
last
the
40
idea
years.
that we're all now fighting each other.
Do you think
the whole campaign for independence was not a single voice. It was many voices for many reasons who believe, as I do, that independence offers us the best route to create a fairer and more prosperous Scotland.
Yeah.
But everyone was crystal clear that if we win the argument for independence, will then have loads of arguments about what a fair and more prosperous Scotland looks like. It's not the end of the argument, it's the means towards having it in a way that can deliver. So let's stop all this, fight and carry on, and deal now with the hand that we've got, which is a pretty clear hand,
Craig.
and let's get on with it.
No, I mean, in one way, the both votes SNP hashtag, or however you want to define it, was a success because the SNP did win more list votes than they did in 2011. It's just that there was an increased turnout. The increased turnout to an extent benefited the SNP, but the party it benefited the most was the Conservatives. In a lot of seats you saw the SNP vote creep up slightly, but the Conservative vote coming up a good deal more. So, you know, the both votes SNP message in that terms was a success. It just, on the overall picture, as a share of the overall list vote, it was down by 2% compared to 2011. And I think we might look back on this on the 2011 to 2016 Parliament as actually being the outlier, because this result, if you look at the 46 and 42% of what the SNP ended up with, 47, 42, whatever it was, is actually kind of reflected in the result. They didn't win 50% of the vote, but they're close enough. So it's more or less a proportional result compared to 2011, which actually, if you look at it, wasn't quite. They didn't win 50% of the vote then either. So
I wonder though, if we're kind of framing this as who's to blame, as if there's a fault, it's a problem. And clearly, I mean, many people would have preferred to have seen the SNP having a majority. Fair enough, they didn't get a majority, but is that a disaster? I mean, Jean, for instance, I mean, what cannot be achieved now that could have been achieved with a majority?
Well, no, it's not a disaster. First of all, no, it's not a disaster. The SNP polled over 1 million votes for the first time ever, a party that did that. A clean sweep across 6 out of 7 cities in Scotland, including this one. Majority of constituency seats in Ayrshire, including my own. You know, this is a pretty good result in terms of winning a popular mandate for the manifesto that the SNP stood on. Pretty clear mandate. So what cannot be done? I can't think personally off the top of my head of anything that is in that manifesto that cannot be delivered on the basis of agreement with other parties who are in that parliament, who would share those views on a range of different matters. But the point that is being made is that our parliament in Scotland, for all the reasons that you absolutely agree with your analysis of why we ended up with this bit of an odd electoral system that we have got, but one of the potentials that system gives is that you actually have a politics in the parliament that is based on discussion and the development of ideas. That's actually not a bad thing. That might be one of the reasons why the UN is quite interested in what we do here. Because it's not all about shouting at each other. It is about saying, a bit more grown up. You and I, Richard, I'm just using you as an example. Okay. You and I might passionately disagree on something. That does not make you a bad person. Doesn't make me a bad person either. We just passionately disagree on it, but there could be something we really
do you think, Jean, I mean, actually the result, I personally firmly believe this, that it actually will help re-energise, you know, the politics, I think, in a way. I mean, post the referendum, there was particularly from an SNP perspective, there was a certain kind of, not complacency set in, you know, but there was a kind of surety about their position or whatever. You know, this is not negative, it's positive. The result is a positive one, but at least it kind of focuses the mind a little bit. And it's also cleared the kind of battlefield to some extent as well, which I think will help focus minds considerably. I mean, do you think that's a fair assessment?
I do think that's a fair assessment, in as much as I'm not going to agree that the last government was complacent or the last SNP was complacent. But
it's not the government, but there was a community within the nationalist community that was getting a little bit complacent.
I think the debate was a bit naive in thinking that, yes, it was almost as if, yes, nobody lost to independence vote, but we did really well in Westminster. And we've got this majority government, and hey, we're on a roll. Well, no.
And we're the moral victors.
Politics isn't like that, and we shouldn't be hugely surprised at the Conservative vote. I mean, not that many years ago, Scotland was a conservative country, and we've tended a wee bit to overstate this notion that Scotland is this left-wing, thorough to social justice, the length and breadth of the piece, morally superior, etc. There are many, many things about community politics and social justice and fairness that are really, really important in Scotland and distinguish us from others in some ways. But let's not get carried away with that. And so having that level of conservative vote, I think, is to a degree an accurate reflection of where voters in Scotland are. But also, whilst the papers are all having a field day today about Ruth and how well she's done, Ruth has now got to stand on her pins and answer for what Cameron is doing. Yeah. She can't pretend. She did manage it in her election literature to kid on that she was near Tory. She can't keep doing that. You are part of a Conservative and Unionist party. You stood on a pro-union ticket. Now explain away what he and Osborne are doing to countless families and individuals, the length and breadth of Scotland, simply to pursue their ideology of looking after the rich and the powerful. Go on, Ruth. Tell us how that one works.
Yeah. See, this is right. I kind of disagree a little bit with David talking about re-energising politics. I don't think the result will re-energise politics. I think we're going to have exactly that conversation. It's going to be Ruth Davidson standing up at FMQs going, your government's bad, and Nicola Sturgeon going, no, your government's bad. And that's kind of what we're going to get for the next 5 years.
So we had Kathleen Caskey from Women for Independence on a couple of weeks ago talking about the listening exercise that was done amongst women in Scotland and the desire to do politics differently. Yeah. We've had Murray Foote, the editor of the Daily Record, tweeting this morning saying he's high hopes for Jean Freeman.
That must be nice to know. Daily Record's in your corner.
But zero expectation of a different politics. Scotland anticipates more of the same old. How do we do it differently? How do you and the other MSPs, particularly female MSPs, start to bring about a different kind of politics? Because it's essential.
It is essential. I'm not sure I have a straightforward answer to that. I'm sure there's going to be, talk about a double-edged sword. Thank you, Murray. But, it is a wee bit of that kind of, cynicism that's saying, I had a nice idea, Hen, but it'll never work, right? So I think Women for Independence is a classic example of how politics is done differently. There are women are members of that organisation, which has grown since the referendum, with all sorts of different views, and we have passionate arguments and disagreements, but we do not then go and slag each other off. We don't dismiss each other as members of the human race simply because we disagree, whether it is on fracking or nuclear weapons or whatever it might be. And so it will be in the manner of our behaviour, without being able to say it will be on this policy or that debate or that committee place. It will be in how we behave. Now, I like a good argument with the best of them, but I am not prepared to be infantile about it. We need some grown-up politics and grown-up behaviour, and I think there are people in that parliament who are returning and people who are new, and not just in one party, who are perfectly capable of doing that and pursuing it. What we then need to do is challenge some of our mainstream media to report it as that and stop looking for the quick headline that is all about it being adversarial.
Yeah, and back to what we're saying, pitching the female leaders against each other in a kind of mud wrestling contest.
It's not just that. If you permit me a brief rant against political commentators who have spent years complaining about a one-party state, and now we have a more balanced parliament, and therefore that, instead of that being a good thing, that's a bad thing too, because it shows that the SNP are on the slide. There's no outcome that shows anything other than the SNP in a bad light for these people. However, we just need to live with that, because that's the way things are.
Well, yeah, but we still won over 1 million votes. So that mainstream media and those commentators need to catch on to the fact that no matter what they're saying, people aren't really listening. They're not influencing. Over 1 million votes, majority of constituencies, and all the other good things about that result. All that SNP bad stuff really didn't have that much of an impact.
One of the things I'd like to look at, and I guess talking about the National now, you're a columnist for the National. We have in the National has columnists from the SNP, it has columnists from Rise, it has columnists from no parties, it has columnists from the Green Party. Sunday Herald similarly, and Common Space is quite a wide group of people. At points in the campaign, and I don't mean to over-egg this, but at points in the campaign that was used by some people against the National, more explicitly against the Sunday Herald, because the Sunday Herald was more supportive, I guess, of the use of the second vote for the Greens. I guess what I'm asking is, how does it feel on the National when you read criticism from within the movement, within the Yes movement, of the breadth of writers that the paper has?
It feels quite, it's quite upsetting when you sort of read some of the bloggers and the tweeters who have a pop at the National and Common Space for daring to criticise the SNP government, or daring to say, or have someone writing something that might not be the SNP had the greatest things in the world ever. It is upsetting, but also I think we get kind of really caught up in it, and we get really kind of caught up in Twitter and in social media, and we think, oh my God, look what G.A. Ponsonby's written. I bet everyone in the independence movement thinks this, and they don't. Only G.A. Ponsonby thinks what he writes, and I'm sorry to mention his name and give him
indeed, because there are other bloggers available.
Yeah, exactly.
But is that not? This is what when I was talking earlier on about re-energising. Maybe that was the wrong terminology. Sure. What I was talking about was maybe a re-examination tactically of how we approach things. Certainly how the Scottish Government and the SNP approach things in light of the result. Because one of my things that really gets me is this degree of insular, incestuous bickering that goes on constantly here. If half as much energy was expounded, I think, in thinking much more clearly about who is the enemy, who are the opposition here in terms of who we should be training our guns, our political guns on, it would be much, much better. But there seems a fantastic amount of energy expended on this kind of internal bickering. And that has to change. I mean, it has to change. And I'm wondering, in light of the result, and given this, you're either unionist or you're for independence, will that actually shift now? Will that clear the lines?
Where's Common Space in this discussion?
We get much of the same criticisms from many of the people that you would be talking about online, but and while it does really grind you down at times because they're quite persistent, they're very targeted and they can get quite personal, you do need to step back and remind yourself that is actually a very, very small number of people that are doing it. It's the same people
but they have a disproportionately
that are doing it.
loud voice, though, in a lot of ways.
They do, but I mean,
only because we're listening to
well,
them.
that's my point. Again, we're focusing attention and listening to it. This echo chamber, all of which is a kind of dilution of energy, of political energy and political direction. And that's an Achilles heel.
In terms
the unionists can capitalise.
In terms of doing things differently, though, talking about doing politics differently, I think that we get so caught up talking about the negative side of this bickering online that we don't look at the positives. And the Common Space is one of the reasons that it was created was to give a platform to people who felt they didn't have a voice in the mainstream media. So we're talking about the kind of campaigners, grassroots campaigners that came out of IndieRef maybe and from wider things than that didn't necessarily go into politics but are still very much politically engaged. So thinking about like the TIE campaign, the campaign for LGBT inclusive education in schools, Jordan Daly and Liam Stevenson have done phenomenal work. They've done absolutely brilliant work, and Common Space has become a place where they can go, where they can try and push out the news of what they're doing. They can talk about their campaigning tactics. They can teach other people from that. Other people use it to learn, and you've seen some real successes there. The TIE campaign has done very well. It managed to get in, I think, all of the party manifestos. It's been to Parliament, and it's gone from strength to strength. There's been other campaigns that Common Space has covered where we've had similar successes. We've managed to get questions into Parliament sometimes on the back of what people, non-professional journalists, just interested people have been doing and using Common Space and the other new media outlets in the National as well as platforms. So I think that there's some really, really good positive stuff within the new media, and we do get a little bit distracted, and it's easy to because you feel the weight of that
because
criticism.
There's positive stuff within Twitter as well.
Yeah, exactly. There is still some great stuff going on there. So I think we need to just remember to remain from the media perspective, remain focused on. There's been huge progress made since before the IndieRef in terms of the media landscape. You now have a national daily newspaper that is pro-independence, a Sunday paper that's pro-independence, and a new media that has managed to become quite established now, I think, in the landscape, rather than before IndieRef when it was still seen very, very much on the fringes. So there's been great progress made, and I think sometimes we maybe do give a little bit too much voice to some of these tweeters or bloggers that in reality, sometimes you can even see what the viewer count is on some of those articles, and it's tiny, it's minimal.
Yeah.
But I guess
don't think it really bothers other people in the same way.
From a human point of view, we tend to like things that say we're good, and we don't like things that say we're bad. But for Women for Independence and for other organisations during the referendum, Twitter was a massively positive thing. It was a great. I remember it was a great place to be very often. Did you find that before you decided to stand for the SNP as an organisation that was born of the independence movement? How did you feel about social media then?
Exactly the same way as I feel about it now, to be honest. I think social media has a potential to be a really powerful, positive force, and it has shown itself, and still shows itself to be that. But equally, it can be distracting and negative, and we forget that sometimes we're just talking to ourselves. And on the question, and I think we did that a wee bit, actually, in the run-up to the referendum vote, where we perhaps were taking our assessment of the likely outcome of that vote overly much from what we were all reading and following in social media, as opposed to what was going on out there
in
where
the real
everybody else
world.
is.
Yeah.
And in terms of the criticisms that the National gets and the Sunday Herald and Common Space, I mean, my own view is please ignore those. You are not any party's broadsheet. And actually it was really critical that we have quality journalism that scrutinises and criticises fairly. And at the minute, in the other papers, that is absolutely what we don't have.
Yeah.
So, don't become any party's broadsheet. Parties are quite capable of producing their own.
Yeah, absolutely.
You are national media, and you need to stick with that and hold those political parties to account, challenge their views, question them, because that way those opinions and policies get better.
Yeah.
And parties shouldn't be afraid of that.
In terms of the new media, or indeed the new, not so much the new media actually, but new politics, and Craig, this is probably an unfair question of you, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Given that the polling system is supposed to create a kind of new politics away from that very binary or adversarial thing, what would the new politics look like? How would that be reflected? How would the new politics reflect the electoral system?
The new politics thing is a big question. It's been written about from different perspectives in terms of how the parties interact with each other, how policy's made in Scotland, how the committee system works. Now, the electoral system clearly tries to encourage coalition government, minority government, and if you're in a coalition or you're a minority, you need to work with another political party to get your legislation through Parliament. We shouldn't forget that governments don't necessarily have to get things done through legislation. I mean, there's statutory controls and things like this. I mean, you look at a lot of the things that the SNP government did when they were a minority the first time around, things like national conversation, for example, didn't require legislation. It was just a government initiative. So we have to consider that. I think if you read some of the academic literature, at least on this new politics stuff in Scotland, it's quite critical of the idea. How different has Scotland been since devolution? In some ways it has been, sure, but it's a very adversarial place. It's not meant to be. It's designed in a particular way. The chamber's designed in a particular way, so people aren't across the ballot box, the dispatch box, arguing at first that PMQs, well, we have FMQs. And I think the SNP are as guilty as of any party because they kind of wanted that at the outset of the Parliament as well. In terms of how policy's made, the Scottish Parliament and the civil service in Scotland doesn't have the capacity that you have down in Westminster. And in that regard, the Scottish Parliament and the civil service has had to kind of outsource its policy-making capacity to centres like in universities, and that's probably a good thing. But is that driven by a desire for new politics or driven by the kind of the constraints that are written into the system? And I mean, I don't know, and I've heard this kind of anecdotally, but if you go down to Westminster, you'll have quite a lot of cross-party friendships. You know, people in the Labour Party and the Conservatives will be quite happy to hang out behind the scenes. And I mean, anecdotally, I've heard that's not necessarily the case in Scotland, that there is a tribalism there. That, I mean, it's culture, isn't it? It's a sticky thing. You can design a system however way you want, but if the culture of that politics is still very adversarial and quite, you know, it likes to bash each other quite hard, then, you know, you can't just turn it around by creating a system in a different way.
Talking of bashing hard, we haven't actually looked at one aspect we've not looked at, I guess, is the problems of the Labour Party and where it's found itself coming third. Jean, you at one point had links to the Labour Party. What would you put down their problems to simply their role in the referendum campaign, standing shoulder to shoulder with the Conservatives? Do you think that's it? That was the only problem they had?
No, I think it goes back before that, because I think the mistake that the Labour Party made in supporting the creation of a Scottish Parliament was in thinking that, having done that, it was job done, and failing to understand that politics is a dynamic process. So if you create a Scottish Parliament and you give it powers and you work to make that effective and it delivers some of the things that you want it to do, then that has an impact on how ordinary people in Scotland see themselves and what their expectations are. And so you start this dynamic process. If you think that that's all job done now, then you're not thinking ahead. So I think that that's where the problems in part began. And so you had, one set of senior Labour politicians thinking that reluctantly they'd support the creation of a Scottish Parliament because that would kill off the Nats. Another group who actually genuinely believed it, of which Jack McConnell was one.
Although there was a camp which, once they got it, the best thing they could come up with was "let's be the best small country in the world," which she was like, "Oh my God!"
Well, indeed,
that was all it was.
But then,
it was about.
So my point is that not thinking beyond the creation of a Scottish Parliament, and inside the Labour Party at a UK level, taking on that political debate and argument that allows you to move your politics in Scotland forward, is a mistake. That leads to then best small country in the world.
Absolutely.
Things that you don't do because that would upset Number 10, and Number 10 has a Labour leader in it. It leads to almost an inevitable positioning on a platform beside the Conservative and Unionist Party. Where do you think they'd be opposed to independence? You inevitably end up standing beside them, and you don't expect that to be toxic. You don't expect that your own people will find that really hard to swallow. So it's actually not a one-off thing. It is a process of not understanding, in my view, political dynamic and developing your analysis. And that is in part a characteristic that says all we need to do is win power. Win power, job done.
Yeah.
Actually, no. Power has to be for a reason, and your politics need to keep developing.
There isn't anybody here from the Labour Party, so I'm going to bend over backwards to be nice and put forward the things that the Labour Party may feel. And they may feel that a lot of independence people said to them, you've taken a stand against independence and that's really wrong, and in fact if you were to be supportive of it, it might be good for the Labour Party. And Kezia Dugdale at one stage during the campaign said, you know what, there are circumstances under which I would vote yes, and everybody piles in on her saying, oh God, you're all over the place with independence, you don't know what you're doing. I thought that was really ungracious. I thought if a Labour leader says there are circumstances under which I would vote independence, people who support independence should say, well done, you're absolutely right, because clearly it's nuts to say otherwise.
But this is this tribal politics that you were talking about, Craig, isn't it? I mean, this culture of
Well,
But
sorry.
also, to be fair, I mean, after she said that, she said, no, there isn't.
Well,
Your
yeah.
system might-
You know,
Well, no wonder.
so that-
no, to be fair,
no,
she
come
got
on, no
she got
wonder,
a kicking.
Richard.
She
Come
got
on.
she
You're
got a kicking, and then she said,
political
"Well,
leader,
okay."
make your mind up and stick to it.
Okay.
Now, I to an extent agree with you. Right? Anyone actually, if Ruth Davidson was to walk in the door now and say, "Do you know, there are circumstances where I'd support independence." Good on you, Ruth. Let's talk about what those are.
Indeed, although the
But-
world then would crumble and we'd be in a twilight
Well,
zone.
there would be all sorts of weird things happening. But, you know, I think, you know, Kezia was a bit all over the shop. And what that means is you lose credibility. Because folk think, right, so that's what you said at 11:10. What's going to be your position by 3 o'clock this afternoon? How do we know? You can't do that.
Can I make a point about Labour? I mean, if you, I take your point that Labour didn't think ahead, if you like, and think about how they could vision and create a new vision of the future of the constitution. But if you look at the structure of devolution, the structure of the British state, how were they going to do that? Because on the one hand, you've got a party that's trying to win in a devolved setting, but then you've got this massive block of Scottish MPs that don't want too much devolution, because then you start opening up problems in the West Lothian question, and they tied themselves up. I mean, Labour is the party that is become embroiled in the mess that the British Constitution is, more than any other party, and it's tied itself up. I think the other thing to think about Labour structurally and socially, you know, the book that Eric Shaw and Jerry Hassan have, The Death of Labour Scotland, they don't talk about the death of Scottish Labour, the death of Labour Scotland. The structural underpinnings of a Labour support in Scotland have been eroding for 20, 30, 40 years. And you don't have that kind of that huge unionised industrial working class vote anymore. And what's happened is that there seems to have been a drift and away from Labour towards the SNP, because social democracy, socialism in Scotland has fused itself with the constitutional question. And the people who are more likely to vote for independence are on the left. And this election, I don't see where Labour go, because now I think that the constitutional question has become quite polarised. There's very little space in the middle. Labour could technically fill that now, because they don't have the problems of having those big block of Scottish MPs anymore. So in many ways, that's kind of problem solved for them. But it might be too late. I don't know where they go from here.
Is there a cause or a case for a Labour Party in Scotland that's separate from the Labour Party in the rest of the UK?
I think there is obviously I can see logically how that would maybe make some difference, but I would go back to the point that sometimes a party can rejig things internally, but if the structures are against you, if the context, the society you're trying to win votes in has changed so much, changing where the party has power, where funding comes from, how members are selected, how much difference will that really make? Not in the short term, anyway.
Round the table, because we're running into some time problems. Round the table, if we can say, because we've not really touched on India F2, because we could talk about that forever. But how do we get to India F2 now, in the current climate, in the current landscape? Jane, where does India F2 sit in the whole frame of reference thing, and how do we reach it?
This is not, by any means, I don't think the kind of, the conclusive answer here to your question,
Yeah.
but two things strike me. One is that we look to find ways for the pro-independence movement to stop fighting amongst itself and find ways to continue to take itself forward. And two, the SNP in government, because we will be in government, continues to find the means that it can pursue a bold and ambitious programme that shows people that Scotland is increasingly capable of not only governing itself, but of doing that in a way that meets what the majority of folk actually want to see their country look like.
Okay. Okay.
I'm not obviously going to make a point for either side, if
No,
you like a
no.
punt, but
I guess in
Can I
terms of
see,
the electoral system and where we are in terms of support for it, is that going to remain pretty much as it is? Because it has maybe remained pretty much as it was.
well,
at the
I
referendum.
think the SNP to call a referendum in the next couple of years would, on the whole, probably be daft, because I don't think they could win it. I don't think enough's changed. I don't think that 55% that voted no, it's roughly going to be there again. You could maybe make an argument that the turnout second time around would be lower, but I mean, do you really want to win a referendum on those terms? I'm not convinced that I think the SNP leadership might actually breathe a sigh of relief if there is if the UK votes to remain in the EU, because the conditions, the economy at the moment, some of the figures haven't been great. You've got some of the reports in the GER statistics, what's happening in the North Sea. It does add more strings to the pro-union bow. You could argue that. It may be a more simple message to articulate from a pro-union perspective. I think an independence referendum. Nicola Sturgeon's setting high thresholds there to kind of as much set the conditions upon which one will be called, also to make sure that one isn't called prematurely, because they're worried about the Quebec example, if you like. If you call another referendum in the next few years and it's lost, that's it. You can't keep calling referendums. Maybe the option is some form of maybe stepping back from this kind of unionist nationalist debate and kind of thinking, well, what could we do in the middle that would kind of satisfy everyone? But I think the debate has become so polarised that there'll obviously be mutual lack of trust, that the unionists would try and fix it to prevent independence, and the nationalists would try and fix it in order to create a stepping stone to independence. So it's very difficult to see with the debate being so polarised as it is.
Andrew, in the national, you would say many national leaders would want an independence referendum tomorrow.
Yeah, absolutely. But as Craig said, it would be lost. And Nicola Sturgeon's not going to hold that referendum until she's confident she can win it, which is where we had this talk of the 60% figure. I personally, my reading of the situation is we're probably almost a decade away from that place, you know. I don't think we're going to have one in the next 5 years. I think our politics is probably going to be yes or no, so we're going to be having this discussion for a long time, but it's
See, for some of us, Andrew, we'd like it a bit quicker than that. Yeah. Because some of us don't know we're going to be here in 10 years.
Speak for yourself.
I am speaking for myself.
Angela, what do you think?
I agree with Jean about the Yes movement, about trying to find, I think it's important to try to find ways for the Yes movement to channel their energies into something else. I think that's where some of this bickering comes from, is it's just, you've gone from people being out on the streets and doing talks and at meetings and leafleting, and there's so much going on around the yes-no question, to suddenly nobody really knows what to do, but everybody's still passionate. So finding ways to channel that, I think, would be great for the movement. But other than that, I mean, I broadly agree that people that write for Common Space are primarily pro-independence, and we've had quite a few articles from people saying that they feel like the currency question, for example, there's certain key questions within the NDRF campaign that the SNP couldn't really answer properly, and there are still people now saying that there needs to be a refreshed focus on real research analysis in those questions and coming up with a better, stronger case. So I think let's stop thinking about the race towards NDRF 2 and the triggers for NDRF 2. There's so much fixation on that, when I think there's plenty of other things that you could be sorting out in the meantime, and getting a hold on those things.
It's interesting.
So I think you need to. I think the focus needs to shift away from talk of when is it going to be, when is it going to be. I don't think that's the big question actually right now.
I think what's interesting about what you said there about answering the big questions. I know the SNP have said they're going to do some work over the summer in that, and Business for Scotland is doing something similar over the next 12 months. They've got a project called Scotianomics. 25 plus academics from all over Scotland who are going to be looking at finding some answers, a variety of answers to the questions that weren't answered to the satisfaction of the majority of
that's
Scotland.
really positive, and I prefer that approach of sort of positive vision thinking, where you're talking about the case, that you're putting forward the case of what could be, because I think now there's a risk with Ruth Davidson in Parliament as the opposition, and she, for all the talk of everyone's talking about NDRF during the campaign, that was very much Ruth Davidson. She kept that on the agenda, and she's going to continue to do that. I think the SNP is going to be up against a much stronger pro-union force within the Parliament and within the media as well. I think that line is going to get stronger, and it's going to feel more like two sides to this again. So I think injecting, taking some of that yes movement passion and putting that into creating positive case, refocusing on that sort of stuff, I think would be great, but I suspect that might be harder than it sounds.
David, you've got 2 minutes to say. How can I ask you one question?
Yes.
How do you get, because you've seen it on Twitter, not just on Twitter, how do you have a discussion with somebody that you disagree with and without it going into, you are an idiot for not realising the genius of my
Oh,
argument.
don't use.
No, I don't
don't
mean you.
use Twitter in that sense. I mean, one of the things. How do we move to India F2?
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
No, how do we move to a place where we can have
well,
the argument?
let me
like
address that in a sec. But I mean, how your initial question about
Fine.
moving into F2? I mean, I was of the view personally that we should have moved sooner rather than later. For a while there, I really did because I was concerned that there was a momentum loss happening. That the actual wider Yes movement was beginning to get quite fractious and broken down and beginning to kind of bite at each other more than anything else, and that remains a problem. So, but I've reconsidered that position. I think it is some time away. You're also got to remember that no matter how much of a strategy you have, there's external factors that you don't have any control over, which are going to be brought to bear, which will refashion the political landscape in the future, whether it be Europe, whether it be this new platform and kind of battlefield that we've, as a result of the election here, that's been created. Above all else, though, I think the only way we're going to move towards India F2, whether it be 5 years or 10 years down the line, is if we stop burying the hatchet in each other and start focusing the strategy and tactics towards that long-term plan. That's the starting point. I don't know how long it's going to take, but if we don't do that, we're doomed. The infighting has to stop, and the refocusing has to be refashioned.
On that note,
Thank you very much for joining us today. Again, thanks to all our guests, Jean, Craig and Andrew, David and Angela. From Richard and I, we've really enjoyed today. Have we?
We have indeed, yes.
You were hesitant there.
No, I'm sorry, I was thinking of something else. Yes, no, we've really enjoyed today, and it's this the consensus has broken out, which is very good, and couldn't agree more about trying to find out a way of having a debate without tearing ourselves to pieces, which would be really handy. Thank you very much for watching. See you next week.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.